out there in YouTube world. It's another episode of the Carolina Sports Guy. If you haven't already subscribed, please do so. It doesn't cost anything. Hit that like button. Hit the bell notification to be notified for more content in the future, such as on today's video. Give me some comments. Let me know what you think about today's video and what you'd like to see in future upcoming videos. Okay guys, today we're going to be talking about the very first professional sports franchise in the Carolinas. Now, I'm not talking about minor leagues or teams AAA or flailing leagues that didn't do anything. Really considered the very first true professional franchise would be the American Basketball Association's Carolina Cougars. Because remember, 4 of these franchises would move on and join the NBA. But first we're going to look, how did the Carolina Cougars, how did they originate? How were they born? Well, the Houston Mavericks, and we know the Dallas Mavericks in the NBA, but the Houston Mavericks were a charter member of 1967 of the ABA. Teams like Indiana Pacers and the Kentucky Colonels, they started right away year one. But they sold after 2 years of struggling in Houston, and the NBA was trying to get a foothold in Houston. Of course, the Rockets would later on be in Houston. A group sold to Jim Gardner and some other businessmen from North Carolina. And he decided to move this franchise to North Carolina. Now, at this time, you're talking about 69. Charlotte's not the 16th, 15th, whatever you want to call it, maybe even the 14th largest city in the United States like it is today. A big metropolitan area that can host every sports franchise there is. They're not even as big as Raleigh is today. Raleigh's grown to a point, with the NHL in Raleigh, they've been considered for other sports leagues as well. And Greensboro, even though Greensboro is not considered at one time, Greensboro was a very prominent city. It's grown to a point that it's done well, along with Winston, Salem. But mainly, you look at pro sports in North Carolina, you think Charlotte first, then Raleigh. To a lesser extent, Greensboro because of the ACC tournament. Now, as looking at the Carolina Cougars, one thing we're going to have to do, they changed the name to the Cougars. They're going to use the colors Carolina blue and cardinal red. That Carolina blue looked a little Tar Heelish, kind of mixed with a little bit of Duke, but more light blue. Cardinal red like NC State. That was the team colors chosen, and those colors lasted from 1969 to 71. The very first coach of the Carolina Cougars, 1969 and 1971, was Bones McKinney, the former head coach of Wake Forest. So they try to keep with somebody who's got some ties to the ACC region. Now, one thing interesting, since they were Carolina, they were a regional team. It wasn't just for North and South Carolina. But basketball was big with the Big Four. You're talking about Wake Forest being in Winston-Salem, Duke being in Durham, Carolina in Chapel Hill, NC State in Raleigh, with a lot of alumni from those schools living in Charlotte and Greensboro and all throughout the Carolinas. So many of these games would be played at the Greensboro Coliseum. And Greensboro was kind of on par with Charlotte with population at that point in time. Charlotte would get a few games in at the old Coliseum. Raleigh had Dorton Arena, which was small, and Reynolds Coliseum, which had some history to it on the campus of NC State. And they even have a few games played in Winston-Salem where Wake Forest play at the Winston-Salem Arena. Now, 69-70 season was probably the second best season they had, the very first one. They finished with a record of 42 wins and 42 losses. They ended up getting in the playoffs. They lost in the playoffs, just like the Charlotte Hornets do. First round loss to the Indiana Pacers 4-0. On that team, you had some local talent. Bob Verga, who played at Duke. Gene Littles. Now, many people don't know Gene Littles. He played at High Point, small school in North Carolina, but he stayed on this team for many years. And believe it or not, would actually coach the Charlotte Hornets and play a prominent role in the franchise, in the business side, in the basketball side of operations for the Hornets as they enter the NBA. So he's got a little bit of basketball history with him in the ABA and the NBA. Doug Moe played early on, who was a graduate of North Carolina. Randy Mahaffey played at Clemson. Bill Bunning played at Carolina, and Larry Miller, who was very instrumental in the late 60s in the Final Four runs for the Tar Heels. So these were some individuals that played on the 69-70 squad. Now, 1970-71, Bones McKinney's last year coaching, struggled a little bit. They dropped off. They finished 34-50. They didn't make the playoffs. Of course, they had Vargas still, Littles, Mahaffey, Miller, and Van Williford. One player who came from NC State that did play on the roster for the Cougars. Then we get to 71 and 72. I believe this is the period of time Ted Munchak, earlier after the first year and the second year, ended up buying the Carolina Cougars. And he's going to change the team colors at this point in time. Going to change them to green and blue. And that's kind of what a lot of people remember because of the later years, although not their most successful years. So we get Tom Mechery. He becomes a head coach. They finished 35 and 49 and 71, 72. Gene Little's again playing for him. Larry Miller. Ed Manning. Not many people know Ed Manning. Jackson State University. He's going to play with the Cougars for a period of time, for a while here. He's going to settle into this area in Greensboro. He is the son of Danny Manning, and many of y'all remember the 1986 NCAA champion Kansas Jayhawks. Danny Manning was a junior or senior, #1 draft pick by the LA Clippers, but he won them the championship. The reason why I bring that up is because Ed Manning played for the in Greensboro for the Carolina Cougars, ends up settling down in the area, and Danny Manning played high school basketball in Greensboro. Of course, his dad gets offered a job with Larry Brown, who would coach the Cougars. He goes on to coach Kansas and brings Ed Manning along, and Danny Manning, the rest is history. He gets out of Carolina, plays his college ball at Kansas, and moves on to the NBA, playing with the Clippers. Tom Owens, he played college ball at South Carolina. So it's kind of in the ABA's, in the South Carolina stint in the ACC before they go independent. Tom Owens is a player off those great South Carolina teams that was coached by Frank McGuire, who also had coached North Carolina to their 57 championship. Now, 72-73 by far was the most successful campaign for the Carolina Cougars. They finished 57 and 27. They win the East Division. They beat the New York Nets 4 games to 1. They go to the Eastern Division Finals thinking they're going to get a championship. They're favored. 3 games to 3 against Kentucky, the Colonels. Controversy. Playing the 7th game, and instead of playing in Greensboro, well, they played the majority of the games, and they had a pretty dominant record. I guess the ownership group felt that we should hit Charlotte's a little bit bigger than Greensboro. We're trying to get this area spread out for the whole team. They were losing money. They were trying to keep the team there, but they were still very much well-loved in the Carolinas, and one of the more successful teams. If you were only going to pick 4 or 5 teams out of the ABA that were successful at the gate and people talked about and had a chance to stay alive in this league, it was going to be the Carolina Cougars. But they played a game in Charlotte. They didn't have as big of a home court advantage. They blow the game, and they end up losing 4 games to 3 to Kentucky, which was heartbreaking. Now, Larry Brown is the head coach, and that was the difference, 72 through 74. He was the head coach of the 72 team. Mike Calvin, ABA great play for them. Joe Caldwell. Billy Cunningham, the great Billy the Kid, played from the University of North Carolina. And Gene Little's again, and Manning, Tom Owens. Steve Previs played at UNC. Dennis Wysick, I believe that's how you say his name. Wysick was a very big player for the Tar Heels in the early 70s. And Mike Lewis from Duke. These are some prominent people that played in the colleges around. And then we get to the 73-74 season. They finished 47 and 37, not as good as the year before. And once again, they lose to Kentucky in the playoffs, but this time first round, 4 games to none. Tom Owens is on that team, Dennis Wysick, Joe Caldwell, Mike Calvin, Jim Jones. Later on, he played with the Cleveland Cavaliers in the NBA. Ed Manning, Billy Cunningham, and Gene Littles. When the 74 season ends, they're losing a lot of money. Talk about the league dissolving. We're down to about 7 teams. And they're sold to a group from St. Louis. They become the Spirits of St. Louis in 74. Because they're only going to last 2 years. They're going to fold in 76. And when the NBA did merge with the ABA, I don't know if Carolina would have got in anyway because St. Louis didn't get in. Kentucky doesn't get in, so that kind of boded what Carolina would have been, even though they were kind of cut above attendance and population. It kind of boded what the NBA do. Indianapolis was taken, Indiana was taken in the NBA. San Antonio, big market with the Spurs. New York Nets were taken in. Of course, they'd become the New Jersey Nets, and the Denver Nuggets, because Denver was a growing market at the time. Like I said, leaving St. Louis, which was Carolina, out in the cold, and Kentucky. And the one team that did not make it through the end of the season was the Virginia Squires. And they had a pretty good rivalry with Carolina, playing in Norfolk, Virginia, and had some pretty prominent players. I mean, if the Carolina Sports Guy was going to ever include anything outside of the Carolinas, I would do a video about the Virginia Squires, because they played an hour down the road in Virginia. And they were regional. They played a few games in Richmond, but mainly in Norfolk and Hampton, Virginia, mostly Norfolk at the Scope. But they didn't finish the season, and they would have been left out in the cold. And they really sold the rights to Dr. J to the Nets to get them into the NBA, because he moves on to Philly. But anyway, this is the franchise, 1969 to 1974, the Carolina Cougars of the ABA. What do you think of today's video? Leave some comments. Hit that like button and pound it. Let me know. Hit the bell notification to be notified of future content like today's videos, and let me know what you liked in today's video, what you didn't. And by all means, subscribe, folks. It doesn't cost anything. I will see you next time on another edition of the Carolina Sports Guide.